The history of heavy.
Double digits, baby. Double Sun merchandise. We are at episode 10. We are not talking about Sun tonight. We are, in fact, talking about the Jimi Hendrix experience in the context of being the podcast that chronologically analyzes heavy music across genres, song by song. I am one of your two co-hosts, Michael Huntsman, joined as always by my dear pal, Big Daddy Dave Lieberman. Dave, how are you, my friend?
Doing good. How are you, sir?
I am good. These podcasts are these episodes are recorded at a time that things are happening, and then they are released at a time where those things have presumably passed. So we don't often talk about necessarily quote unquote current events. We are talking still about the 60s. But last episode, episode 9, we discussed Black Sabbath and their appearance at Villa Park for the end of the beginning, at the end of the beginning. Anyway, the final ever show of the original Black Sabbath lineup. Things have evolved since then. I am wearing my Praise Iommi Sun shirt. Tony Iommi will, in fact. Oh, there you go. We
match.
We are brothers in Iommi. Tony Iommi will, in fact, be at Villa Park for the Black Sabbath set. Although we have learned in recent days that maybe Ozzy Osbourne isn't exactly going to be participating in Black Sabbath set at Villa Park. So
he'll help out where he can, apparently.
Right.
I'm not sure what that means, but it means I'm not going.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a sigh of relief. So to catch listeners up, again, Black Sabbath's final show ever in Birmingham, England, this summer. Anybody who listens to this show is probably aware and a fan that the tickets sold out immediately. Dave and I were hot in the queue trying to get tickets, willing to kind of sell our children to get to the show, to make the pilgrimage to Birmingham. But as we were unable to get said tickets, as the demand is insane and the prices are even more insane. But it has been announced in a couple over recent days that Ozzy isn't going to necessarily play the whole set. He'll participate, sounds like sporadically. Hard to blame the guy who is obviously suffering from Parkinson's.
I was surprised they announced this at all. Like, I had written them off. Like 1999, they did a reunion show, and I'm like, whoa, these guys, and like they're not much old. They weren't that much older then than I am now, but I also didn't live the last 25 years as a rock star. Like,
you didn't write Snowblind, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's the short of it is I really, in my more advanced years, do not like music festivals. Although I go see a lot of live music festivals are not my bag. I was going to make the exception for this one. Now it is a bit of relief that we don't have to spend all of the insane money convincing our wives why this was a good idea. Because now I'm glad we didn't get tickets in the queue, because this sounds like it's going to be a complete clusterfuck. I don't know who's singing with Black Sabbath. Ronnie James Dio is dead. Ozzy is of very ill health, and
I mean the first reunion show I saw in 1992 in Costa Mesa, Rob Halford sang with them. That would be a great addition. But they literally have an all-star cast of metal for the rest of the bill. They could have one per song. That would be pretty epic. Also, still not going to go.
And literally every one of those bands has released a Black Sabbath cover. if not multiple. So they can cover a set, you're right, pretty easily, which will be very cool. And I look very forward to the streaming live event that I'm sure Amazon or whomever will pick up and share with us with much better seats than we would have been able to obtain at the actual event. So all is well in Black Sabbath land as far as I'm concerned. But tonight we are not talking about Black Sabbath. We still have, I'm looking at the calendar, we've got a pretty good ways to go before we get to Black Sabbath, because we are not talking about anything from...
interestingly, we don't have that many years. We're in 1968 and Sabbath comes up pretty quick in years, but we have a lot of songs to cover between now and then. There's a very active period for our conversation.
It is indeed. And as mentioned last week, when we were talking about the Velvet Underground and Sister Ray, 1960, also released in 1968, as is tonight's subject. Lots of this specific year to cover. This time, again, it is about the Jimi Hendrix Experience's Voodoo Child's Slight Return, or Voodoo Child, if you like. I will explain that momentarily. But before we do that, we need to continue to talk about what was happening in the world in 1968, and we do that via Dave's Cultural Corner. So, Dave, tell us what was happening.
Dave's Cultural.
Welcome to the corner. What I've done for 1968 is split it up because there are so many songs, and we're going to touch on a few things each song. And so I'm kind of going quarterly a little bit. But for the months of March and April, March 1st, the first performance of Andrew Lloyd Webber and a Tim Rice musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, in its original form as a pop cantata by pupils of a private school in London. March 11th, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson mandates that all computers purchased by the federal government support the ASCII character code encoding, which is a foundation in what leads to these. March 18th, the gold standard. The United States Congress repeals the requirement for a gold reserve to back the U.S. currency, and we have been backed by the faith and credit of the name of the United States. It's all fake.
Rudderless ever since.
Ever since. April 4th, sad day. Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., shot dead at Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee by James Earl Ray. King assassination riots erupt in major cities, lasting for several days afterwards. A couple days later, speaking of which, April 6th, a shootout between Black Panthers and police in Oakland, California results in several arrests and deaths, including 17-year-old Panther Bobby Hutton. April 18th, London Bridge is sold to U.S. entrepreneur Robert P. McCulloch for reconstruction at Lake Havasu City, Arizona. It's now a tourist attraction. It was actually the bridge of that time was dismantled and sold, and they made another bridge there. April 20th, Pierre Elliott Trudeau becomes 15th Prime Minister of Canada. You might recall him from such roles as Justin Trudeau's father. Justin Trudeau is the current Prime Minister of Canada.
Nepotism at its finest.
Tying a thread from then to now. I did want to throw in a couple of pop culture stuff. The 1968 Grammys that were recognizing 1967 performances. Some highlights there. The Beatles and George Martin for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was Album of the Year. Song of the Year was Jimmy Webb for Up, Up and Away, performed by the Fifth Dimension. And Best Recording for Children was Boris Karloff for Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which was cool.
Amazing.
And real quick, in the Oscars, the 1968 Oscars, which again we're honoring 1967 work, postponed 2 days due to the MLK assassination. And I skipped over the actual films because I got lost in a rabbit hole, which I thought was really cool. For the first time since the introduction of the Academy Awards for Best Costume Design in 1948, Edith Head did not receive a nomination after tallying 30 nominations and 7 wins over the previous 18 years, making her the most awarded woman in the Academy's history. Head is considered to be one of the greatest and most influential costume designers in film history. She was the inspiration for Edna Mode in The Incredibles. And I saw a great quote of hers. I fell down a rabbit hole, started watching interviews. One of the greatest quotes I saw: "A dress should be tight enough to show you're a woman, but loose enough to prove you're a lady." I just thought that was class.
Very good. Very good.
So when we're going to get into the summer of love, but not until the summer. So we'll get there.
Okay. Good stuff, Dave. Thank you. We talked about this maybe 2 episodes ago, but now when we get to 1968, as you just explained, specifically with the Grammys, that popular culture has shifted from that old guard of, Sinatra and Dean Martin and Herb Alpert and all of that stuff to, rock and roll, and psychedelia. I mean, Sgt. Pepper's being recognized.
In fact, another snippet from this Oscar blurb I read was that this year, black and white and color categories were merged into one. So like, color was no longer the newfangled thing. It is now the norm, and black and white is fading out. So you can just roll it in as an example of old guard handing over to the new guard. Yeah. Interesting stuff. Well, tonight's topic again is very much all about the new guard and new sounds. Recorded on May 3rd at the record plant in New York City, the Voodoo Child's Slight Return was written by Jimi Hendrix and released on October 16th, 1968, 6 days after my birth, and was also the last track on the Jimi Hendrix Experience's 3rd album, Electric Ladyland. The song includes an improvised vocal and guitar by Hendrix, who is, of course, backed by Noel Redding on bass and Mitch Michell on drums. The recording of the track began at 7:30 in the morning, which seems insane, probably after an all-night bender. Hendrix was effectively just started playing a series of hammer-ons, a technique by playing with just the neck hand while guitar playing. That was influenced by the intro of Albert Collins' Shuffle. Steve Winwood, yes, that Steve Winwood, sat in on the session playing organ and recalled of the sessions that there were no chord sheets, no nothing. Jimmy just started playing and singing, and the rest of the band joined in. They recorded 3 takes, with the last being the version that appears on the album. The title of the song, as alluded to at the top, is often confused, as it is sometimes listed as Voodoo Child with a D, as on the US release of the album, and sometimes as Voodoo Child without the D, as it was in the UK, though they are the same song. This is of Hendrix's own doing, as he often would change the spelling of the song on set lists and then in notes that he would send to the record company. So he was kind of ambiguous as to the spelling, but it is in fact the same song. The song would go on to become Hendrix's only #1 single on the UK charts, but only after it was released upon his death in 1970. So it hadn't been a single until after he had died. Rolling Stone magazine included it at number 101 on their 2004 list of the 500 greatest songs of all time, which I think is probably a pretty fair assessment even today. So Dave, Jimi Hendrix, heavy dude, his guitar playing heavy, his vibe, the time 1968, as you just described, heavy. Is Voodoo Child heavy? Talk to me about this song and your relationship. Voodoo Child is heavy.
Yeah.
This is a heavy song at a heavy time from a heavy guy and a heavy band.
Yes, sir.
I really like this song, and I like this song as a good example of, not only our conversation, but his contribution. Like, he was such a phenomenon. And there were a bunch of musicians kind of in that era that were flash in the pan musicians, amazing talent, did stuff for music, and we lost them to drugs. but Jimi Hendrix is in the top of that heap, like just amazing. He played his guitar upside down and strung backwards, and he just knew what he was doing. He was exuding talent. And one of the things I really like about the band is his vocals. His voice is so strong and smooth and clear and deep and confident. We talked about that in one of the songs before. There's a Lou Reed, right? Like there's a confidence that comes from.
Yep.
But Lou Reed's confidence is like nonchalant. Jimi Hendrix's confidence is like, I'm in control of this moment, whatever it is. This is my moment. You're witnessing it if you want. Take it or leave it. It borders the arrogant, but he wears it well.
Yeah.
Heavy song.
Yeah, he's a really interesting figure as a musician because he is one of the rare breed that, at the time, the experience, Noel and Mitch were both British. Hendrix, the only American from Seattle, but the only American in the trio. But all of their fame and popularity and buzz about the experience began in London. And so all of the kind of guitar players of the day would clamor to the clubs in London to see him play. We talked about Eric Clapton when we talked about Cream. Certainly Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, all the great players, all kind of blues inspired players were going watching this guy do these incredible things that they had never seen done on a guitar before. Then he would also go on to influence an entire generation of virtuosic, shredders, the Eddie Van Halens and Yngwie Malmsteens of the world many years later would be influenced by him. So he's that sort of rare cat that influenced all of these players that were playing all kinds of different music and taking bits and pieces of his playing and being inspired by different parts of it, whether it was his ability to play, his hands were famously huge. And so his ability to kind of spread and play across the neck, and how fast he could play, and techniques that nobody had ever seen. Obviously, playing with his teeth was kind of a famous thing. But then how emotionally he played, and he was sort of everything in one dude. Not even to get into the singing and how great his voice was and what a great songwriter he was or any of that. He is kind of fundamental. He's one of one, and certainly on anybody's Mount Rushmore of most of important guitar players of all time. And then notably, we didn't talk about this when we talked about the Rolling Stones. I don't even think we mentioned Brian Jones's name when we talked about the Rolling Stones. But unless I'm missing somebody, Hendrix would be the second member of what would become known as the 27 Club, as he would die not even 2 years after this song and Electric Ladyland was released at the age of 27. So burned really fast, left an indelible mark, 3 albums with the experience, and then 1 record with the Band of Gypsies, a bunch of live stuff and whatever. But very singular. And I think, he might be the manifest of all of the versions of heavy that we have talked about so far. Sonically heavy, emotionally heavy, presentationally heavy,
Culturally heavy.
Kind of heavy in every way. So fun to talk about him. I had a big time Hendrix phase where I listened to Hendrix a lot, kind of when I was first meeting you. I had a couple of the Experience albums on LP. Then they had when CDs became the thing, they had re-released them and remastered them as as CDs, and I bought those and played the hell out of them. But haven't listened to Hendrix regularly in many, many, many years. And just going back to hear this song is like, fuck, man, what have I been doing? He's so good. But tell me about your experience and relationship with Jimi Hendrix.
So my experience with the Experience is interesting. I, turned on to them when I was 15-ish, maybe. And I was coming into music, kind of coming out of pop music at 13, I want to say, and found some alternative stuff that I liked and connected with, and some punk rock that I liked and connected with. And something that I've noticed is that there's this era of rock that we're now in that has become like a developmental phase for at least teenage boys, which is Zeppelin, Hendrix, Pink Floyd. You hit this phase where it's not like it's oldies, it's not classic rock, it's this timeless rock, but it connects to you when you're turning on, tuning out, and what is it? Tune in, turn on, drop out, right? That was
Yep.
What's his name's acid thing. Too many.
Larry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this moment in teenage development where you're coming into your own, and there's something very visceral about this music that connects. And again, like, this is happening in America's adolescence, right? America is having this teenage moment where, and we've talked about how the teenager was a demographic, it becoming a demographic at a certain point. Well, by now, the teenage demographic has taken over and overcome and become the dominant, right? This is leading into the summer of love, and this is going to be the wave that we're still riding the crash of today. It was the Cultural Revolution, it was so profound and so important and carried so much momentum and had so many people, right? There was the baby boomers were of an age where there's a critical mass of them. And so they're taking over all of getting into professional jobs and also being a demographic. And so they're moving and shaking, right? They are the dominant operators on the scene. And this music connects with individuals as they're going through their personal metamorphosis in adolescence, because I think this captures the sound of the generation and the nation's adolescence. Very heavy. It's heavy because of it's got all of that weight.
Yes. I say this a lot, and I mean it when I say it. Very well said. This is a. Correct me if there's one I'm missing, but by my estimation, this is one of only two periods in musical history, let's say, to be dramatic, where the subculture has become the popular culture. So when we talked about Sgt. Pepper's being recognized at the Grammys, and the Beatles weren't subculture, so I don't want to confuse things there. But in terms of, particularly for the sake of our ongoing conversation about heavy, the first time of two in history where heavy music is the popular music. If you think about Hendrix and Zeppelin and Sabbath, and then Alice Cooper and Ted Nugent and Aerosmith, like heavy music about heavy shit. The only other time would be in the 90s with grunge, where Soundgarden and Alice in Chains are pop radio. Yeah. And they were all influenced by all of these bands.
They don't exist without this period.
They don't exist without these bands. And I don't think, I do think that Hendrix is, of everybody we will talk about, I'm looking at the schedule, until we get to Iggy and the Stooges, I think. No, we're talking about Sabbath before that. So until we get to Ozzy and Tony and Geezer and Bill, specifically Ozzy and Tony, specifically Ozzy, I think Jimi Hendrix is the single most identifiable personification of heavy that we've talked about so far. You know, maybe heavier songs than Voodoo Child in a variety of ways, but I think Hendrix kind of embodies everything that this podcast is about as a person, which I think, you know, he's infinitely interesting for a million reasons, but I think specifically for the conversation about heavy, he's a very interesting and important character.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah,
couldn't agree more.
And
there's, you know, like we could have picked a half a dozen Jimmy songs to make this point, right? There are more than one. But the song, to your point, the song is less important than the person, because he brings all of it with him, including his discography.
Yes, you know, and again, I think I have made reference to this on other podcasts, and I will probably reference it again on this podcast. It's probably more context than I need, but many years ago in the early 90s, I had a book called Spin's Guide to Alternative Music, and basically it was, you know, an A to Z book about you know, every band you could think of. And I discovered a million bands just by, you know, Slint and the Afghan Wigs and Big Black, like some of my favorite bags of all time. Like I dug into as a result of this book. And the little blurb about Husker Du I have thought about a million times, and it describes how, as you watched Bob Mould's fat, sweaty body playing his Flying V on stage, as every drop of sweat hit the stage, another band was formed. Was how important Husker Du was to what would later become all kind, you know, speed metal and thrash and pop punk and a million different things. But even more so with Jimmy, right? And you know, Voodoo Child, I wanted to talk about specifically. I don't even know if it's my favorite Hendrix song is his cover of Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower. I think it's the best cover song ever, and I love that song. But I want to talk about Voodoo Child specifically because that opening guitar riff, that then builds and turns into what we now know is this 7 a.m. jam session. But that opening guitar riff could be the intro if slightly down-tuned or slowed down or played on a keyboard or any number of things. Could be a Sabbath song, could be a Soundgarden song, could be a Sun song, could be a Stooges song. There's a million like that and it's, you know, we talk about slow as being significantly more heavy generally than fast. I think Voodoo Child is a better representation of Hendrix's contribution to heavy than Fire, as an example, would be.
Oh, sure. Yep.
Because that riff is so heavy, you know, and he's playing it on
and the pace of it is,
yeah.
The pace of it is heavy. You're walking through mud, you know, like your boots are sticking in the mud. You're shin deep in this. You can move, but you're moving at a certain pace. Right.
And like Husker Du, and like Cream, we're back to another power trio, right? Where that quote unquote simplicity of just a guitar, a bass player, and a drummer can have a weight that a 5-piece might not have.
Which is non-intuitive, right? Because a 5-piece is more people, more instruments, more music, more sound, but that isn't what makes things sonically heavy to me, typically, it often is a power trio because there's a simplicity and a complexity at the same time. I remember us having a conversation about the Beatles song Blackbird, and I was like, I don't know, I don't get it, I don't see the there, and you're like, no, that's the point. Less is more. And I've thought about that a lot. I was like, oh, wait a second. When I look at it that way, it has a huge impact. There's what you get in these power trios is the presence of absence. You get the negative space. You get what isn't being filled up by a whole bunch, like a horn section. And I love a good horn section.
Yep.
Right. But that is a different part of what I like. It's not so much heavy, typically. But you get this presence of absence. So you've got the three players and they're filling their space, but there's room to move. And that room is part of what they're building. And it actually becomes a element of the composition.
So compare this song to Sunshine of Your Love, which is your current champion that you'll take into Song v Song later this episode. But talk about, when we talked about Sunshine of Your Love and specifically Cream as a power trio, one of the things that we talked about is kind of what you just said is how the simplicity of that song makes it so powerful. That as talented as those three guys are, the riff is pretty simple and it's very straightforward. Voodoo Child, not the most complicated thing, and certainly Hendrix has ever played, but there is a lot more going on in that song with what the players are playing than in the Cream song. Any take on the complexity of Voodoo Child or not at lending itself to just the heaviness of the song?
I thought about this because picking a winner was a real struggle for me.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get to that. So it's kind of a yes and answer. If it wasn't the Jimi Hendrix version, because there's other versions out there, I wouldn't say yes, the complexity adds to the heaviness. But Jimi Hendrix's voice and his attitude, and we talked about this with Link Ray, that makes the complexity part of the heaviness for me for this song. So the short answer is yes, the complexity makes it heavy. The long answer is because it's Jimi Hendrix.
I think that makes sense. I think just on their face, Sunshine of Your Love, if you don't know anything about either of these bands and you just hear the song, Sunshine of Your Love is definitively a sonically heavier song. But I think what you just said, everything we know about their personalities, and we don't need to get into Eric Clapton in the 80s again. Hendrix, sadly, never had a chance to fuck up his reputation in the 80s. But I think for all those things, everything you just said, including the album cover, that Voodoo Child is heavier for all of those intangible reasons. Something we ask on most episodes, unless it's painfully obvious, and often it hasn't been so far, what genre would you call Voodoo Child specifically? Yes, but also Hendrix in general, like psychedelic rock, acid rock. We've thrown around a bunch of subgenres. So
I don't know. I call it electric blues, and
still
that's also where
Yeah.
And that's where I put the first two Sabbath albums, and the later ones less so, but the first two Sabbath albums go electric blues to me. And that electric blues, I've been chasing that dragon ever since Sabbath. And I find it with, and I didn't realize that I was on the trail, but things like Cream, that's a blues, there's blues, that's blues, right? It's Clapton. And that's where he comes from. Yeah, I call it electric blues. Blues is already a genre. Turning on the amp changes it. It takes it out of the delta and puts it into kind of a more modern, gives it a little bit more, gives it more of an edge and more of an attitude and less of a, it's, you know, the old blues tradition was about this lament, right? It's this, it's the blues. You're down, you're depressed. It's sorrowful and it's kind of mournful. But this electric blues is like, man, I'm kind of pissed. It's a different take. It's a little bit of a swivel.
Well, we didn't talk about the first. I love this distinction. I don't use that designation regularly, but I don't disagree with it either. The first time we've talked about it on the show was on the Cream episode. We did not talk about it on the Rolling Stones episode, who are definitively a plugged-in blues band. So would you call the Rolling Stones an electric blues band?
I call them a honky-tonk band. And
okay.
I think they kind of would too.
Yeah, for sure.
It's in the blues tradition, but it's a very distinct flavor. And it's just, for me, a little too buoyant, for lack of a better term. And I keep thinking about my comments about the Stones and how, like, I just could never connect with them and I actually dislike them. And I've tried to re-listen to some of their songs since that episode to just try again. I just can't, dude. I just can't. I don't know.
There's plenty of other shit to listen to if it doesn't
right?
touch
It's
you.
like cooked salmon. I can't eat cooked salmon. I grew up in Portland. There was salmon everywhere. I tried. We had salmon every week. Not into it. Sushi, down with it. Lox, gimme. I can't eat cooked salmon. I don't know. Same with the Stones, right? I'll listen to blues. I'll listen to, other music of the era. Can't dig the Stones.
Yeah. I'm half a mind to try to get you there with the Stones, because for a lot of years I was out on them, and I've been voraciously back for many years since that lost weekend, as it were. But maybe we'll come back to that at a later point. I don't want to spoil the answer to this question that I will ask you.
I want to ask you what genre you would put this song in.
I would have said psychedelic rock.
Okay. I mean, that's which is true. It is that.
It is, but I like electric blues better. I like it better. I think it's a more apt description. It's a more descriptive description, if you will, of what Jimi Hendrix is. So I think that's really good. And you know what I like about electric blues, and you just said it, that I think psychedelia doesn't have, or at least in my mind, it doesn't connect this way, is it implies a darkness.
Yeah.
That Hendrix absolutely has, and obviously Sabbath. And
the psychedelic is a little bit, again, too buoyant. It's a little too
bright. Yeah.
Right. That's the right word. It's a little too bright.
Yeah. So just to tug on this thread a little bit more, and I don't want you to spoil. I'm going to just ask you this question again in 7 episodes, but I want to ask it now in the context of the conversation. What would you call Led Zeppelin?
Electric blues.
You would.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So
I mean, Dazed and Confused.
What's hard rock? What's hard rock that isn't electric blues? Like Kiss?
Kiss is hard rock.
Yeah.
There you go. And it's not electric blues, and it has blues structure, but it isn't leaning into the blues part.
Yeah. Okay.
We have to understand, and we have to take as a given, all rock and roll comes from blues. So all rock and roll is going to have blues in it, right? But it is going to be blues forward or blues passive, if you will, blues active or blues passive.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's just the chord structure or blues, but it's not played with the little like emphasis. When you put a little emphasis on it, that gets you bluesier. When you just kind of play it straight, it's more rock and roll to me.
Yeah, I'm a big subgenre nerd. I love subgenres from, you know, grindcore to black gaze to, you know, drone metal to everything in between. I love subgenres, and I have 5,000 Spotify playlists to prove it. So this is a thread that I want to absolutely continue to pull on, because while technically you are right that, you know, almost all of, well, if not all of this music comes from a blues scale, like technically what
Sure.
people are playing are the blues. But once we start to get into things like Gang of Four and Public Image Limited and Ministry, and you're going to have a hard time connecting those dots.
Yeah.
But as we are connecting the heavy dots, I think connecting these blues dots and garage rock and all of the different things we've talked, psychedelia that we've talked about so far, I think is really interesting. And not that everything needs to be categorized, but I think
Well, but that's the fun of this conversation,
that's right?
Like
That's
that's where the fun is. Well, so all these subgenres are the Bob Mould Sweat analogy.
That's right.
Right.
That's
like
right.
and in fact, it's funny, I was just listening to an audiobook about Greek and Roman mythology, and in the Greek mythology, there's several references to blood being spilled into the earth, and because the earth is a goddess, it springs forth life. And so that Bob Mould metaphor is very apt, but the life that springs forth is different than the blood that was its seed. It just contributes, right? Just like the human DNA has two parents that contribute to create a brand new thing that isn't one or the other, but somewhere in between, and becomes its own thing. And the farther you get down the tree, yeah, there's this genetic connection, but boy, is there a difference generationally from specimen to specimen. So it feels like that, because Ministry is hard to say is rock and roll, and Gang of Four is hard to say is rock and roll. But without the rock and roll tree dropping the acorns to have that natural selection happen, we don't evolve to Ministry and Gang of Four and grindcore and black gaze or whatever you called it.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah. Anyway, we will get into some black gaze later on. Yeah, you know, the thread and the inspiration is always very interesting to me. You know, we talked about the Velvet Underground last week and how influential they were to so many bands that became significantly more commercially successful than they were. And Hendrix's music is specifically, I don't think is necessarily for everyone. I think, you know, a lot of people don't like Hendrix, but there is some point where you are a fan of Hendrix, whether you like Hendrix or not, because if you like Van Halen, or if you like Frank Zappa, or if you're like, pick your, crazy genius level guitar player. Yeah.
They're all progenies of this seed.
Right. How has your relationship with Hendrix been in recent years? You talked about kind of discovering him when you were like 15. Has it been a consistent relationship all the way through, or is less so in recent years?
Yeah, less so. This episode made me go back and, had a similar like renewal moment. Like, oh man. Part of the issue for me is that I just have less opportunity to listen to music in this phase of my life. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of on screen and work and on the phone at work. And so I can't have music in the background, not this kind of music for sure. And like, I'm an active listener. I don't want to listen to music in the background. I come from the tradition of headphones, listening to music, looking at the album cover, reading the liner notes, holding it, that's what I think of when I think of listening to music. And so I just don't have that space very much. And it just occurs to me. And I used to commute. And so I'd listen to music then, right? I work in my house. I don't commute. I'm on the phone or in, video calls.
You have a school-age
so
daughter who has musical tastes that maybe aren't yours.
Yeah. And I've tried to, turn her on, and I had some moments. We had some moments.
She's dropping out. Yeah.
We connected a little bit on Sabbath, a little bit on Maiden, but those were moments, spaces in time, moments in time. So yeah, like I need to get back and spend more time intentionally with Hendrix, but there is a long list, and I don't know if I'm going to get to the force feeding myself some Rolling Stones if I've got to get more Jimi Hendrix in my life. You know what I mean?
Fair. Let me ask you one more thing before we're starting to get a little long here. That I don't think has come up in any of our 9 previous conversations, but will certainly be coming up next week and then in multiple episodes after. We've never talked about vocal melody or singability as it relates to these songs and heaviness. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or opinions about, I guess the way I would ask the question is if singability takes away from the heaviness of a song potentially, if that melody, Voodoo Child isn't necessarily a song that inspires me to sing along for whatever reason. It's perfectly singable, but it doesn't. And none of the songs, I guess Satisfaction, You Really Got Me. Some of these songs, Louie, they have decent enough hooks, but we've never really talked about, we've talked about some of the vocal being heavy. We talked about the Sonics and the Witch and how that screaming and the 13th floor elevators and how the vocal delivery is often heavy. Any thoughts, though, on the vocal melody and the ability to sing along with a song can subtract or attract the heaviness?
I had never thought of it until you posed the question. I don't think that I think it only works one way. I don't think it can remove heaviness from a song. I haven't experienced that, and I can't think of an example of that. But there's a neutrality or a net positive. So like if singability, I sing along to Sabbath all the time. When I'm listening to Black Sabbath, I'm singing to it. By myself, of course. Nobody can be around to experience these moments. But it just comes out, right? And it's like there's certain music is emotional and it moves, right? And I've talked about this before. I cannot dance, but there are certain songs where my body starts moving and it's like, whoa, it's just, I'm compelled to do this. And there's plenty of heavy music where I'm compelled to sing along. And so it certainly doesn't make it not heavy. And I can't think of an example where the vocals change it from otherwise heavy to not heavy.
Yeah,
or singability, not the vocals, but singability.
Yeah, this came to mind. I have a very specific habit of singing loudly along to music when it's played in a room, and what I do, much to my wife's chagrin, is I ride the Peloton, and I was just on the Peloton tonight listening to one of my noise rock playlists, speaking of genre playlists. And so I'm screaming along madly to, the Jesus Lizard and Cherub and Unsane and whomever. All songs that I don't know if you would define as kind of melodic or singable, but to your point, I am really compelled to scream along with them. But that's, it's just an interesting thread to, I think, again, to pull on as we go through this, but whether the vocal adds or distracts from the heaviness.
I'm just impressed that you can do cardio and sing.
Well,
Like that's just impressive.
yeah, I do get a little winded, and there was some big black stuff that was playing today that was pretty difficult to sing in cadence. But that I digress. We don't get to big black for a long time here. What we do get to next week is some definitive heaviness and certainly some singability. We are staying in 1968, and we are staying heavy. The only song really we would have the opportunity to talk about this band, but we will be talking about Iron Butterfly's Inagata Devita, which I think will be awesome and a good time. But before we do that, we have to decide which of our songs are going to go forward to compete against Inagata Devita next week. I will go first because I can tell you are struggling. I have had The Witch by the Sonics since episode 4. So it is ruled much longer than I anticipated it ruling for me, but that reign has ended. Jimi Hendrix and The Experience are going to take out The Witch, and Voodoo Child is who I am going to be taking to next week. Dave, who do you got?
It was a battle. But I'm sticking with Cream.
Okay.
And it's maybe because I heard it before I heard Jimi Hendrix. I heard that Cream song and it just imprinted. I have a very visceral connection to that particular song. So it survives one more time. We'll see if it makes it another.
I think next week is going to be tough, but we are both taking power trios into next week. So Cream and the Jimi Hendrix Experience. So that will be good. In the meantime, please subscribe and do all the stuff you're supposed to do on YouTube and your podcast platform of choice. As always, that was a lot of fun. Keep it heavy. Thanks, Dave.
Always a pleasure. Okay, thank you. Bye.